Hello. I get very moved after teaching day. So much emotions through the pieces of music narrated through my students' own psyches. It's a two-way trip. Of course, the rationale matters, the organizing of the thoughts compared to the impulsive instinct that the music brings you and that you reflect in your playing. So it's easy to put words on, like a conductor who organizes the shape but doesn't touch the playing. And those who play do the job that you have to do while being on the ground and above the ground, especially when you have to negotiate bridges between sections. Of course, once you're in a gorgeous second theme or lyrical aspect or some kind of first fiery theme in expression, you're in or out of it. And most of my students are in it, either intuitively, either intellectually, and who is to measure or question? But the bridges that bring into each other during the form of the piece either go under and then you have to rebuild the energy, or that's artificial. Either the over blissfully exalt too early and then they have to sort of either drop again or bang and stagnate loud. In other words, the real truth is, while it means something different to each of us, how to organize the balance of the texture between the two hands with a meaningful drive. I give them sometimes lesson exercises that are play a melody on a single note with the same expression, or even in the case of a very driven sonata, in terms of the expression of the texture, of the psychological fervor, or the very calm, and how to get from one to the other without to drop too much or to rise too early. I asked them to play the same dynamic range when there is a driven crescendo towards a climax, where it's an unadulterated happiness, and you just bathe in happiness. Everything is more beautiful than you dream it, because you feel like you're part of your destiny and you can touch it, either because of love or trust or self-accomplishment. Could be the ambivalence between the two in the same character, or a dialogue between two characters, like in theater plays, and then the fourth wall when you talk to the audience, like aparté in French. So you're the narrator, but you're also the actor who is living intensely the characters. Many layers of expression. You have to have a music in the way you say the things that insinuates very subtly irony within drama, or happiness with a little bit of sadness, hope and perhaps hopelessness. Major or minor is too binary, and forte or piano too. And of course you can play with the two as an effect, as a toolbox, but it's more subtle than that. It's admirable to be able to find the right tone for the right expression for the right section. Not more nor less. And who's to define who's right, or how much is right and how not enough, if it's not enough, and who, of course, in the in the incredibly uneven rapport, where the teacher is supposed to be the person who knows the experience, the know-how, all this about the craftsmanship, and at the same time the student who it's almost like has a beautiful recipient and you pour your drink into them. Therefore, you pour your experience, your knowledge, your understanding of the piece. But when you do that, in a way, you lock it, and they need to be free to do their own levels of that. It's so subtle, but they have to. And if they do it with conviction, even if you think they're wrong, because they climax too early, or they drop too late, or the composer stays longer in one or the other functions of a bridge between sections. So you can analytically say, okay, be careful, don't crescendo too early, and then, like I do when I play, and I tell myself while I play something in a continuous crescendo, not now, not now, not now, until I can allow this build-up to happen by the modulation or the harmonization of the different ranges that the composer puts in the choice of the texture, literally the grammar, the choice of the words, beyond the meaning of the words, the music of the words, beyond their meaning. Of course, their meaning, but you could have said it with other words, and all of a sudden, of course, when you say the text of another, inevitably you're reciting, and the people who hear you know that you're not, well, they don't think you're lying because they know that you are for the purpose of it, but you become so believable that you enter in the character fully. And you enter differently fully than another actor, because some aspects of the character's pacing between the words, music of the words, expression or holding back. All this leads to always more questions. So I gently guide them individually towards their potential. Instead of trying to hear and tell them, oh, this is how I feel that section, I try to fulfill what they're searching for, yearning for, perhaps the fingering that doesn't allow to reach it. Then I would find one for them that corresponds to what they are reaching for. I'm constantly attuned to them. Individually, of course, not them as a group. Which is not to say that I don't give my own conclusion of having lived through a given piece for several more decades than them. But that doesn't make me more knowledgeable in this uneven situation. But where is a situation which is even? It's a give and take, it's an exchange. Some people are in... It's always... Then of course it becomes a question of discussion innerly with the composer's intent, way beyond the right or wrong note or the right or not interpretation according to the indication by the composer, allegro ma non troppo, and you go, oh, okay, I'll be very driven and spirited, but not too much. I mean, you are or you're not. Of course, then you have to be careful, because some composers exalt and some others withhold before they reach a certain high point, and it's not lesser than the others, just it's a different time period where the expression of one's own soulful needs and hopes and drives and desires were not expressed so flawlessly or so openly, would probably be considered indecent for Haydn to hear a Scriabin piece today. Way more than nudity, as some actors say. Oh, I don't worry about nudity on the set because there are 80 people around working for the filming. So it's not like they really live the intimacy that they're supposed to portray by the acting of the, or in theater, of what the author wrote, or the stage manager, stage director tells them to do. It's not about being puppet and the others being puppeteers, as the teacher is not a puppeteer either. Well, sometimes it becomes easy to sort of spoon feed and say, okay, do what I tell you and you're gonna sound right. But that means that in the first place, it doesn't mean enough to the student in order to be spoon fed so willingly. But then it becomes believable even more to audiences, because then in a way, when you don't inhale the extra dramatic effect that this piece brings you, if it is, or any expression, not just dramatic, and you have to put the coherence of the right technique approach in order to play it always reliably well, in other words, right. But it doesn't make it well, but right makes it correct. And so you are, in a way, a student who is musically very gifted in the sense that the intuition connects with the piece right away, regardless if it's your taste or not as a teacher, as you connected to the piece earlier in your life. And you have to manage so that all what they understand in the hints and the innuendos of the score, that they can really transcend so that they can perform it, so that the listener can receive it, and not being stuck in their inner world where they heard it, they felt it, so they already experienced it. They don't need to, on top of it, display it fully. They might just, in fact, play unmusical because they're too musical. This is a paradox. My teacher used to say that too. And people who are less intuitively musical, they remain more, their emotions are less clouded by their judgment, and in a way it allows them to be more reliable. And because of their good spoon-fed teaching, they can, it's not fake the word, because that would be arrogant of mine, but I would say to a certain extent there is enough separation between brain and soul that they navigate in these difficult waters with the balance and the emotions and the dynamics and the phrasing and the pedal and the organization of the structure and where it goes, the modulation, the tonality. In other words, more even than all these few elements, and none of them individually at the same time. It's all a fusion, like an experience of human life, you know. And of course you can identify more with a certain section if you have experienced something that this music evokes to you other than just in the third person, you know. It becomes in the first person. Like if you were loving and somebody betrayed you and you play a tragic opening of a piece, it's easy to, well, it's easy, it's not right to say that. It's more, one is more susceptible to not only feel more the music of the composer's own experience centuries eventually before you, writing it, notating it at least. So I'm always torn when I teach between how much to entice them and how much to not burden them with what it means to me. I try to think in or speak in ways like, you didn't misread, you misguessed the note. It could have been, but he didn't write it. You shouldn't drop too early in order to arrive to the calmer section because of the bridge. You want to just decelerate enough to merge in traffic, in the slightly slower traffic, but you don't want to go under and then pick up, because then it becomes less fluid, less natural in the flow of the events. Of course, once you start outside of the track, inevitably you lose sense of where you were once you've gone off track. So you zigzag around to hold in more or less the flow of things, the storytelling. That's why after lessons I am often both driven by the emotion of the spiritual intensity that the music itself tells me and the student, while very careful to keep myself from over expressing what it means to me, because I feel like then it could become an overwhelming capacity of a given student to find their own path in it. Well, they have also the option to break what I teach them in order to find who they are. That's what usually, in general, children do with their parents when they grow up to be adults on their own. But it doesn't always have to be a drama. It could be just a natural flow of events. But the pieces we play, or the texts we recite, or the paintings that we analyze or understand, or they become like family in a way. They become part of our inner psychological soundscape, musically speaking, more than just notes that we learned to organize well. And beyond that, we need to, because without organizing them well, that's why I try to give them wise fingerings or wise distribution of the notation that doesn't always correspond to the composer's idea. Of course, with the orchestration, you would have that idea, but the piano sounds like a piano no matter what. Even if you do shadows and lights, or you do color, or imagine tastes, any analogy reaches a dead end at some point, because, of course, if you are all in your mind thinking that this is not a percussive instrument and I'm singing it, you manage to be convincing, but that's more about capacity of concentration at levels that are hardly attained by most, and continuously so, which is another difficulty, to maintain that intensity in order to manage the details and drive yourself through the piece in a sense of, as the audience believes that the words you say are yours while they are not. And they know that you're not the character, but they like to not know it, because this way they can enter in the storytelling, which in a way is what means to us. So if the actor makes you constantly feel that he or she is acting, or the pianist is constantly technically attentive to do everything correctly, you cannot without, but by itself it's not enough. So in the teaching process, you can isolate the emotional aspect of the piece from the playing aspect of the piece, which is why I spoke to you about my repeated note melody with expression, or the dynamic growth towards dynamic climax in a piece, but without crescendo. In the practicing, I mean. Or adding some rubato of hesitance between one hand accompanying and the other one dreaming like a soprano in an opera, and then the mezzo-soprano who is sort of supporting role, trying to, in a way, by interacting, the writer gives more color, meaning, and blossoming to the character of the heroine. But they're heroes who are wounded heroes or victorious heroes. There's so many shades of subtle emotional display or withholding. And I'm confronted with these thought processes during teaching every time with every student. I feel like each lesson is the only lesson. I feel like I have to be so careful what I say, how I say it, and towards what I say it. Between the music itself, the notation, and the performing of it, there are different levels of constructing it. Like in an opera, you have the stage makers, and you have the set builders, and you have the choreographers, and you have the singing teachers, and you have the vocal coaches. All of these are the same with the piano. That's the loneliest profession. When you play solo piano, when you study a piece solo piano, you can have part opera, part cantata, part requiem, part etude, part waltz, different genres and expressions of human nature according to the composers. Of course, the closest to the 20th century, the more open they are about it. It's almost like as if the form was the egg, then when the chick is hatching, breaks the form in order to exist. And analogies for analogies, everything is relative. But I take it at heart. Sometimes it stops me from sleeping, to the point to which I worry if I somehow didn't push too much towards a certain discipline, towards a tempo compared to the piece, and not just because of the metronome from outside, but counting yourself, using the pulse of the piece in a way to hold to the piece, but flexibly enough to be free while holding into the track of the drive of where it leads you. And sometimes you don't know where it leads you. Of course, you know the piece from memory, so basically you go through the path like you go through the GPS instructions, and you go, okay, I'm gonna go there, there, and there, and I'll turn there. Okay, that is fact. And then you go through, and all of a sudden you get distracted by the scenery and the daylight, rain or rainbow. I don't know. Anything distracts you. And playing is distractful. And practicing is distracting. And repetitive practicing is distracting. In chamber music, at least you attune to each other. But when you play alone, on your own, you get bored. Or if you're very driven and possibly very gifted, you can become easily lazy and arrogant in the worst two situations, because things come too easily to you in the comprehension. But you still have to, and that's the most important part, you have to humbly make sure that you carve it so that it presents itself exactly as either your teacher taught you the style is, either you yourself discovered it through some performance of some other person who recorded it, and you say, I want to play it like this. At least for now. Because it takes at least 3 to 4 revisitations of a piece in a large chunk of life experience time, let's say 20 years. And each time you go back to the piece, somehow some of the layers have settled. The technique with the emotion, or the expression with the organization, the thought processes like a conductor, with the musician playing it like the industry of doing it, while the spiritual elevation that the piece by itself creates in you, and you translate it as a vibrating membrane to the audience. So you become believable in the lie, but they believe it's your notes when you play the notes of the composer, the pitches and the rhythms. And the pedal and the articulation and the phrasing, and all of a sudden a legato that can be over legato becomes glued. But a tenuto, if it's shorter into staccato, can change character and become all of a sudden funny when it was anguished, or dramatic when it was, well, anyway. So who injects the good taste, the right taste? It's probably an experience of lifetime for the student. Here and there, some guideline, some good fingering, and then you let the rest just settle like a good old wine that takes the years it takes to become a great wine. It doesn't mean that they don't play it meaningfully well, dramatically well, and technically superb when they're young, because they do very often. Now, does it extend to what it really means to them? And perhaps they don't have the time to think over these philosophical distances of life, because they only have already at the most 2 decades of awareness of being alive. So, and the teacher has at least the double, for sometimes more, regardless if even less. But if we only teach by the experience, which is essential, because you can tell them this is the point where usually one slows down too much, make sure you don't drop too early to prepare this and that. So you give those guidelines. Do you really hear them in your head when you play, or do you sort of memorize it in your muscular memory and mnemotechnically, so that it sort of guides itself and you just observe it being played while you perform? But the awareness and the hearing of what you produce compared to what you heard from the piece grows with recordings, with experience of stage performance, and that's why the 3 or 4 revisitation of a piece are perhaps even more times. But regardless, it's a gift that keeps on giving, because every time the piece reveals itself differently. It doesn't mean that you have no guts and no spine and you don't hold to your beliefs, because after all, if it's all changeable all the time, then what's the point? No, I think it's temporary truths, even if they're ephemeral, as everything is. Which is why I believe deeply in the fact that we have to analytically read through the notation, almost through what is not written, what is hinted. When composers use these words like allegro non troppo, it's a way to say be driven but not too much in order to be precise or organized. So what? If you don't do the big crescendo that brings you to the climax of the piece, this unadulterated climax, what do you gain by being overly controlling it? Yes, the balance between the instruments, different ranges, orchestrally speaking, like woodwinds compared to brass or strings, which is colorized by the timbres of the orchestra. So in a way, it exists because it cannot not, when it's well orchestrated, naturally, in the first place. But on the piano, this orchestration is hints and fantasies and imaginations of shades and lights, and dimensions in 3 or 2, and depths rather than presences, or in contrast, the articulation between the capacity of over legato or wet staccato. And so once you analyze the structure of what you think the composer hinted, if you hold back too much that intuitive outburst, blossoming of the piece, what's the point to play it? What's the point to teach it? Jean Francais used to tell me that when his father was inspector of the conservatories in France, he went with his dad and listened to endless school productions of concerts where it was boring, according to him, as a child. And since he was very musical, he told himself, as he told me as an old man at that point he was, that as a child he promised himself, I'm going to write music that will never bore the listeners. And he's truly so, even in the melancholical aspect of his music, let less in the joyful, fresh, and spontaneously jazzy almost sometimes. But it is very French in the spirited way. Music, he always did. When you hear few notes of a Francais piece on the radio, or you don't even know where it started, you cannot not immediately connect to his ecosystem of life. Not all the composers don't correspond to their characters as a composer, and of course that would be ridiculous to hope. Dutilleux, for instance, was the opposite of his music in some aspect, and in some he looked like it. Francais was witty and emotional and driven and very elegant, and that's what his music is. Poulenc went to hear Boulet's sonata, and he couldn't imagine where music went. Imagine if Haydn heard the Scriabin piece, as I said earlier. Probably would have been also, it would be so overwhelming that they would be numb, probably, like, what's that? And of course, the composers who died in their 30s, like Mendelssohn and others, had the time to rediscover Bach for us, so generous, create a conservatory in Leipzig, conduct the orchestra, and all that die at 33, or between Bach and Chopin's deaths, 99 years. And music has, classical music of course, has gone such ways to break from the form, to express the emotion unadulteratedly compared to the form that was containing it. But each and all of them, before and since and probably after, will express earnestly who they are or what they felt about where they were. I suppose we don't have to compare the level of feelings, the way of courtship between Middle Ages, Renaissance, 19th century, for instance, or today. But I get overdriven when I speak because I lack words, especially vocabulary, to express all the subtleties in this course, it's easier to give the example and say, oh, come on. But you hear this minor ascending to major, hope after despair, and that is cheesy. So it has to be more than only the grammar of music or the psychology of the music. Leaves it an open question after each lesson too. I'm very thankful that students trust me, and I'm humbled by that. Very.